Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's virtual trust talk with Dr. Brent Fortenberry. We're so pleased you're all here with us tonight, and just you being here with us helps us to further our mission for natural and cultural heritage for everyone forever. So appreciate you all being here and all the support you all give us here at the Trust. So we have Brent speaking to us tonight. He is the Director of Preservation and the Christovich Associate Professor of Historic Preservation at Tulane University School of Architecture. And I'm just really pleased to introduce Brent, particularly in that he's in this new directorship at Tulane. And because we've worked together many years, but more importantly, he has partnered with the Trust for many years now and been working in Bermuda Heritage for well over 15 years. So it's a real pleasure to introduce Brent. Tonight, he's going to be speaking to us about heritage at risk. So from development impacts to climate change to neglect, built heritage faces increasing pressures in the 21st century. In a professional cultural sector with constrained resources, partnerships are critical for heritage conservation solutions. Taking a regional approach, Brent will speak to us tonight about the Heritage at Risk project, or HARP, that brings together governments, international nonprofits, local stakeholders, and university partners to build capacity for managing heritage at risk. This talk outlines HARP's stakeholder-first approach for conserving at-risk built heritage throughout the greater Caribbean, with a particular emphasis on Bermuda. And again, I just want to speak just briefly to the extensive work that Brent has done across Bermuda, and especially in the World Heritage Site. His archaeological work, where he started his career, spans Verdmont, St. Peter's, State House, Whitehall, the Cast Ruin, Springfield, and Paget. Those are amongst some of his archaeological projects. And then in terms of building research, which he's come into more recently, built heritage conservation, he's looked at Tucker House, Reeve Court, Mitchell House, St. Peter's, and Southampton Cottage, amongst, again, just some of his projects. So it's a real pleasure to have Brent speak, particularly because he's just such a long-standing partner of the Trust and a stalwart of Bermuda Heritage. So without further ado, thank you, Brent, and look forward to hearing your talk.
Thanks so much, Charlotte. And it's incredibly nice to be with friends. And I have to say that I miss you all terribly. And I remember the last time I was on the island 2 years ago now in January, just before the pandemic started to pick up. So it's been a real sort of surreal 2 years for me and for my research, but also for the partnerships with everyone in Bermuda and elsewhere. It's been a challenging time and a time for sort of reflection, particularly in the heritage industry, and really provides an opportunity to sort of step back and think about how researchers and universities can interface with stakeholders to provide sort of productive capacity building and resources for the preservation of built heritage and intangible heritage as well. And I think, one of the things that Charlotte and I were talking about before we started today was, this is the first time that I've been lucky enough to sort of speak to the Trust as a director of a preservation program in the United States, meaning that now as an administrator, I can really sort of think critically about how my program, my students can interface with stakeholders in Bermuda, particularly how can our School of Architecture directly, because we're essentially an academic unit, an academic department within our School of Architecture, how can we provide training? How can we provide resources? How can we provide in-kind services for the benefit of built heritage, intangible heritage everywhere that we work? So, that sort of change in role for me, as well as the pandemic, have really sort of provided an opportunity, a space to sort of reassess what we do, how we do. I think that, really, if you think about what I'm going to talk about over the next half hour, think of this as me trying to think about the ways that we, as an academic unit, for me as a researcher, can reframe our relationship with stakeholders in Bermuda and reframe the way that we can help, essentially. And I think that, you know, in the 21st century, with all the challenges that are going on between the pandemic, between social and political uncertainty, as well as climate change, universities need to provide this sort of capacity for good and capacity for more sustainable approaches for heritage across the world. And so that's really how I'm thinking about how Tulane and our program can begin to sort of interface with stakeholders moving forward. And I have to say that I was really sad to not be able to come in January, but again, the testing requirements and whatnot really sort of put our students, our university wouldn't let us come. But I'm hopeful that I'll be able to come, as well as Jane Ashburn, a faculty member here in our department as well, will be able to come this summer to continue to do work sooner rather than later. I hope so. It's been far too long. So I'll go ahead and sort of share my screen. As Charlotte said, you know, one of the real challenges right now is that not a lot of work has been going on. And so, you know, over the last sort of 2 weeks, I was able to go to Barbados and Jamaica as a part of a new group that I'm working with, which I'll talk about today, based out of London, the Commonwealth Heritage Forum. And so fieldwork is just starting to pick up. And so in those 2 years, in those 24 months of being stuck, essentially, as you all know, being in the field is probably the greatest joy of the work that I do. And, you know, all the people that trained me, particularly at Chapel, who unfortunately we lost during the pandemic, really provided that sense of excitement about doing field work. And it's really, you know, where we as researchers at our best are at is when we're out in the field, looking at buildings, working with partners. So what I want to talk today about is about how we're beginning to think about this challenge of heritage at risk, both across sort of the Western Hemisphere and the work that I do, but also in Bermuda, and then begin to frame ways that we're thinking of that we can provide that sort of capacity and support to identify and manage properties that are at risk. And I should say, sort of at the beginning, you know, everything that I'll say here about all the projects that I've worked on, these are sort of my perspectives on them. These are my perspectives as a researcher and the challenges that I face, particularly as an international researcher working on these projects, both in Bermuda and Jamaica and elsewhere. And really just want to frame that from the outset in terms of how I'm talking about these is as a research partner. But in many ways as an independent external research partner. And then I'll end with, you know, this incredibly exciting project that is Commonwealth-wide of this group that I'm working with out of London. And Charlotte spoke at our charrette a couple weeks ago, which was incredibly exciting, in which we brought together stakeholders from across the Caribbean to talk about these challenges of heritage at risk, whether it be management, climate change, development, tourism. And this, again, frames the discussion for how we can approach these challenges at the regional level. So I want to start off, the first image here I'll come back to in Southampton, the Southampton Cottage project. But I want to start off with a project that is sort of taken place during the pandemic. One of the real sort of sad pieces of heritage at risk that we've encountered as a part of our project. So this is a building in Spanish Town, Jamaica, called Manchester House. As you can see, it's this pretty fabulous 9-bay wide, 2-story Georgian townhouse that's owned and managed by the Jamaica National Heritage Trust. The Jamaica National Heritage Trust has few resources, both monetary and physical material resources, to maintain the structure, as you can see. And so here is sort of the primary facade of this building in in March 2020. So this was actually my last project before I was pulled out by my dean from Jamaica during the pandemic. And so as we were told that we needed to go to the airport to leave because the quarantine was going to be enacted in Jamaica, we very quickly took several scans of the exterior of this building because we'd spent the day sort of looking at its condition and really being concerned. The building probably dates to 1750. It's one of the oldest intact urban townhouses in Jamaica. It has incredible sequence of finish. The roof, as you can see, is not really in great shape, and the standing walls are sort of uncertain. Unfortunately, 3 days after we left, the upper floor of the building completely collapsed. So now that's gone. And this happening at the outset of the pandemic when there was lockdown going on, as resources and jobs were uncertain, this really sort of hammered home the challenge of heritage at risk in the 21st century in this pandemic moment, working with our partners. And so unfortunately, this building has not been repaired. And the only documentation that we have of it was the 25 minutes that we spent scanning the exterior of the front facade. And so that was a critical moment for us to record what was there and assess this building as it stood. Unfortunately, the challenges of resources in Jamaica, this building will probably never be rehabilitated because of the challenges of resource allocation there. But this project in particular, it collapsed not because of a strong storm. It collapsed not because of an earthquake. It collapsed not because of any sort of vandalism. It collapsed because a lorry ran into the front of that stone wall at a rapid pace. And even that shaking ultimately collapsed the building. People have gone in and robbed the materials, robbed the framing, robbed a lot of the bricks to be used in other buildings. And so this building is now sort of scattered. All the materials are sort of scattered around. So this is, a major loss for 18th century architecture in Jamaica, but it's something that we as university researchers, we as partners need to do a better job at identifying and better managing these sites that are at risk, because this could have been a part of a major historic area in Spanish Town. It was talk about being the centerpiece to a World Heritage nomination for 18th and 17th century Spanish Town as well. So managing these assets as a part of economic development in the future is really critical to how we need to think about these sites, not just as heritage sites that are visited, but how they function within the framework of economic development activities. Here's another example of a project that I've been working on in South Carolina. This is the only surviving standing rice mill facade. As you can see, it actually sits in the middle of the cruise port in South Carolina. New developers have bought the cruise terminal because they're moving the cruise to the north. And so they are now threatening to knock this building down. It has no protection in the United States. It has no listing. It's not on the National Register. And again, this idiosyncratic piece of built heritage is now at risk. And so what do we do? How can we work with partners to document it? How can we work with partners to advocate for its protection? And how can we begin to pool resources? That's the one thing that university partners have really not done that much in the past, but directly engaging in creating monetary resources to protect these kinds of sites. And so we don't know what's going to happen with this. In all likelihood, they'll knock it down one night as a part of the development of the port. But again, just another example of these pieces of heritage that are in these areas that make them at risk. And then many of you know the project that I worked on with Ed Chappell and Tom James and Larry Mills that you see here, the Southampton Cottage, one of the earliest surviving pieces of vernacular architecture in the West End, really. was under threat because of change of land use, change of land development. And so the deal that was brokered was that we would study this building and then we would get to take it apart and store it in a container, which again was one of these creative solutions that we have. And I think that, you know, in another talk that I've given before, thinking about how to come up with creative conservation solutions with limited resources is critical in being able to think outside of the box. Far too often, preservationists and conservationists come to a challenge with an adversarial approach, and that will only close doors and not open them. And so I was, you know, incredibly grateful that the trust and the museum came together and asking myself and Ed and Tom and Larry and others to come up with a creative solution on how to study and how to protect and preserve this building. So many of you probably have seen these pictures, but you know, we systematically took the building apart and we numbered everything. We numbered every stick of timber, and it's in a container now in the National Museum. Hopefully, at some point, we'll be able to reconstruct it. This building in particular provided incredible insight into the transition from timber framing into stone construction in Bermuda in the first quarter of the 18th century. Additionally, the archaeological evidence, which so one of the things we did was we created a set of drawings. So on the left here is line drawings that are based on Ed's hand measurements, and then on the right, Jeff Klee created this great sort of framing SketchUp model as one of the only enduring, durable pieces of evidence to this building actually being whole as one structure. And then once we took the building off, we were encountered with the cellar, which I excavated with another colleague from William & Mary, and excavated that material culture, and we're working on managing and publishing that. But you can see, I mean, we fundamentally took the building off of the built environment. We took it off of the landscape. We even, you know, took a concrete chainsaw and removed the stove here in the cellar. So it was a fundamental sort of taking it off the landscape, which, you know, many of us had never been a part of before. And so this is the site as it was when we left it, just completely gone. So again, thinking about how this piece of built heritage that was incredibly important, how do we come up with a sustainable solution to study it and protect it, maybe not in its integral form, but as through the sort of process of deconstruction. So that's just sort of another example of a building that was at risk because of many different forces, neglect, developmental pressures. And so we have to come up with these ways to better manage and study these kinds of structures. And then finally, you know, as was happening during the pandemic, Albert Row was listed for redevelopment and deconstruction. And as you all know, these are now no longer there. And so coming up with an approach to identify and triage these sites that might be at risk, I think for me, and thinking about my interface with the trust, and I know that Margie and Linda and Diana have worked on establishing a list of buildings that might be at risk. And so, you know, my big question when thinking about these examples from Albert Row, thinking about these examples from Southampton and others, how can the university help with documenting, managing, coming up with management plans for buildings that are at risk? And I think in many ways, as we talked about a few weeks ago with Charlotte's talk in the Caribbean, Bermuda, for all its challenges, has a system in place that is incredibly robust in terms of identifying and managing through planning applications built heritage that in many other places do not exist. And so I'm talking about the negatives here, but in many ways, Bermuda is a regional example for how Caribbean partners can approach review and management of built heritage properties. And so the first sort of challenge and step is actually identifying the buildings. How do you create a framework to identify those buildings and sites that might be at risk? And I want to sort of throw an example here from Barbados, which is connected to this process. But essentially, what the Barbados Ministry of Culture has done is they've created something called the Barbados National Registry of Historic Places. And the idea of this registry is to push back against the listed building system that was created in 1984. That's 38 years old. That has never really been updated. And so what the Barbados National Registry of Historic Places is it seeks to create an engaged group of stakeholders in Barbados that will identify places of national importance and then nominate them. And so essentially what it's doing is it's attempting to decenter heritage experts by engaging directly with stakeholders and communities to identify those sites, those pieces of built heritage that have value to them today. And again, if you're sort of thinking about how this list is generated versus how previous lists are generated, primarily throughout the Caribbean, heritage protection lists, in whatever form they come, are built on this colonial framework, in that they identify sites associated with great houses, plantations, and that becomes the backbone of how sites are triaged and managed and celebrated. What this approach does is it tries to sort of flip it on its head. And so essentially how this works is that the Ministry of Culture actually just solicits nominations through this portal for people to identify sites. And then there is a group of cultural heritage specialists on consultancy from the government that actually vet these sites and identify these sites that aren't on the National Register now, aren't on the protection register. And so it's trying to create a more inclusive approach and an engaged approach to identifying these sites that are of value to people. And essentially in the heritage lingo, it's what's called a shift from a significance or integrity first approach to a values-based approach. One that acknowledges the fact that these values will change over time. One that acknowledges that listed buildings are not fixed things, that they grow and change based on the different kinds of values that are identified by stakeholders, and how that changes over time. And so sort of thinking about this, one of the things that we're doing with the Commonwealth Heritage Forum is we're creating an intake list through ArcGIS. And this could be something that the trust could think about doing, is creating and this is just an ArcGIS form, creating a way to identify these sites, essentially engaging with citizen scientists that are on the ground and living in these places every day to identify these buildings that are at risk, and thereby create a community of engagement to better manage these heritage resources. And so we'll talk a little bit more about this at the end of the talk, but again, trying to think of ways that a more equitable and inclusive approach to identifying and prioritizing these sites, I think, is critical for heritage conservation in the 21st century. Now, beyond identifying sites, just documenting sites and documenting sites if nothing else, like we did at Manchester House, like we did with the Southampton Cottage. Documenting sites at its core has to be a capacity that heritage stakeholders can look to, universities can look to people and entities with capacity to help with. And that's really the core of what my program is doing now and has done in the past on Bermuda. So students come, document these buildings by hand, create measured drawings to be able to have a record, so that if something happens like happened at Manchester House, if a building gets knocked down for any number of reasons, there is a record of that building that can be archived. Now, I put this slide in 100% for Diana, because she's been waiting for me to send these drawings. But as you can see, here's another example of a hand measured drawing from Globe Hotel that we produced a couple of years ago that we've since translated into CAD. And so in many cases, these are the bare minimum of the kind of inventory with reports and photographs that not just for buildings at risk, but for every building of value we should have, just as a record and a snapshot of the building's condition at any one time. And then of course, as you all know, we take this hand-drawn plan, and then we put it into CAD. So this is an example from Natchez, Mississippi, a framing plan from a quarter that dates to about 1820. And this is actually archived in the Library of Congress. I think finding a way to create a similar accessible and archivable format for the drawings that we produce, for the drawings that other people produce, is critical for the trust working with the National Archives moving forward, to have that national inventory that is backed up and accessible to be able to engage with buildings. Myself and others also, leverage digital documentation, also not just as a way to create enthralling pictures. Here you see on the left a section done through photogrammetry, which is essentially just taking a series of photographs on the inside of a early 19th century quarter from McLeod Plantation, South Carolina. And then you'll see on the right, many of you all will know Longford Ruin in St. George's that we recorded again that summer, that January, just before the pandemic, to create a record of that standing site. We haven't drawn it up yet, but again, this documentation should be the foundation for how we manage this site working with property owners. What can we do to better manage this piece of 18th century architecture within the World Heritage Site as a part of this broader management plan? And then as we have been talking about in another forum, we can also leverage this technology to create highly hyper accurate cemetery maps. And so this is from a site which many of you all have probably been to, called Circular Church in South Carolina, in Charleston, where over just a series of hours, we created this map that's now geo-referenced. We're creating the GIS database in which each one of these tombs will have a clickable file where all the information, historical, archival, and then conditions information will be in a pop-up window. And so thinking about how we can leverage these kinds of approaches for better active management of historic sites, particularly in the East End, the number of cemeteries and burial grounds that the trusts manage, thinking about managing them through a digital online database format, I think is critical for sustainability moving forward in the 21st century. As another example of using this kind of technology, this is, well, I'll just put the slide up there and we'll see if anyone can identify what this is. This is a slice of a building. Anyone want to identify what building that is? No one? No extra points?
Isn't it St. Peter's and St. George's?
It is. So we laser scanned it, and then this is just a slice of the building to be able to create highly accurate plans of the building. And so I don't think I've shown this before, but essentially this is our laser scan model in the upper right-hand corner that then we've created a Revit model, which is an architectural rendering software. On the left, you can see the Revit rendering, and then underneath it, the view of the scan within the point cloud. And then on the bottom, we've extracted traditional architectural floor plans and sections of the building. And so again, just having this that has never been comprehensively done in CAD is incredibly useful to think about, not just interpretation, not just engagement, but also long-term management of the structures. And then we can take this information and do other things. I don't think I've shown these before. We can do architectural renderings of how the building changed over time using architectural software. So this is a architectural rendering from Revit of the exterior. Here's the interior. One of the things we're experimenting with is actually peeling off the monuments and changing the building form and rendering it to be able to show the change of the interior over time and what that looked like in a way that you can't visualize on the site. And so, working with some great architecture students, we've been able to get a baseline for how it is today, but then thinking about how the liturgical arrangement has changed over time and how the structure of the building has changed over time through these renderings. It can be used for interpretation as well. And this is actually probably one of my favorite ones where they put the light through the window on the west side. The other thing we can do is create these interactive 3D models. This is of a great mantle surround from a place called the Clover Fields in Maryland. If you ever get a chance to go on the Eastern Shore, this is one of my favorites. We did this with just over 50 photographs, but we did this because we took this 3D rendering and we gave it to a carver, and he recarved this mantelpiece. My favorite part about this is you see this guy right here. This is a man pulling the tail of a pig, which is a really great sort of early 18th century motif from Maryland. And then we can, create other interactive models like this example from a building, again, that I documented just before the pandemic. This is Longwood House on St. Helena Island off the coast of South Africa. This is actually the house that Napoleon died in. And so we've created a accurate to 3mm model of this building that's accessible on Sketchfab. And so this is a way for people to engage in understanding this site. That's incredibly hard to get to, but it's also a way to engage particularly younger people who live, myself included. Well, I'm not younger. I'm just sort of technology addicted, who live on their rectangles, who live on their phones or their laptops or things like that. So again, leveraging these kinds of tools, not just for buildings that are at risk of falling down, but also how we interpret and manage them, I think is critical for the trust moving forward to better engaging with the management of built heritage. The other thing that we're doing is we're working on taking all that information and actually putting it into an accessible database. So if you think about, say, the Old House Survey as an example of ways that historic building information has been recorded. So in the Old House Survey, you record types of roofs, types of windows, the plan, the construction, the finish, all those things. And so working with folks from the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, we are working on a way to intake information like you see on the left, which is a hand-measured drawing of the Tucker House kitchen, and creating a series of relational architectural terms that will be recorded for each site that then you can search. And so essentially what you could do is imagine having the Old House Survey not on sheets of paper, but having a search box to say, I want to know where all the hipped roofs are in St. George's Parish, or I want to know where all the yellow ochre lime wash on cellar interior walls are. You could search that and then it would pop up in an accessible map. Again, thinking about how this baseline information can be leveraged for both research purposes, but also for management is critical, because in each one of those records, you don't just have architectural description, you don't just have architectural interpretation, you also have condition and what you've done, how you've rehabilitated the site. And so all that comes together in this comprehensive way that you can manage historic building information. And so we recently got a grant from the National Park Service to pilot this sort of vernacular architecture database, is what we're calling it. And we hope to be able to not only start doing this for the buildings that we do, but also roll out the technology to partners to be able to input their own data to better manage their historic buildings. But then how do you take this information and make it more accessible? Charlotte and I have talked a lot about mapping, cultural mapping, and a cultural portal over the last 5, 7, 10 years. And so we can look to examples like this reconstruction of the 1853 Richmond, Virginia, and the area around the slave market in Shockoe Bottom as an example of the way that all this architectural and archival information has been put together into a digital humanities project. And so if you go to the Digital Scholars Lab at the University of Richmond, what they've done is they've taken all this information, they've reconstructed Richmond in and around the governor's house in Shockoe Bottom in 1853 based on that information. And so that would be a way to go from having all your architectural information to then begin to think about how you can reconstruct an environment for interpretive purposes, particularly thinking about the World Heritage Site as an opportunity to engage people in how St. George's changed over time from the 17th century onwards. Other sort of areas of sort of basic mapping. One thing that I've talked a lot about is the development pressures, but understanding the way that long-term climate change, human-driven change of the environment is impacting historic sites. We've begun to pilot ways to identify flood and inundation risk for historic structures. We started in Galveston, and so essentially in the world of flood inundation, understanding where your first floor elevation is critical to understanding the risk for buildings, because in the insurance world, inches can mean thousands of dollars. And so what we've done is we've leveraged digital technology and first floor and base flood elevation, which is essentially what the planning department says how high your first floor should be in new construction to avert a 100-year flood. We've taken this and applied this methodology for historic buildings in Galveston, Texas. And I think this in terms of management of the World Heritage Area would be a critical study for St. George's, knowing the 2D inundation models that we have for Water Street. What we've done is we've scaled this up into 3D to be able to better illustrate the impact on individual buildings. So we laser scanned most of the historic district, and then we took a drone and created a highly accurate 3D model of all the historic districts in Galveston. And so what we did first was to really sort of scare people is we reconstructed the inundation model of the 1903 hurricane. And so basically 10 feet of inundation across the Strand Historic District. And then to get a better idea of actual individual risk to individual buildings, we took a GPS-enabled drone, basically it's called RTK drone, and we created a highly accurate 3D model of each historic district accurate to 2 millimeters based on this 3D mapping. And then we were able to take this information and extract first floor building elevations. And what we could do is we created these risk maps for individual parcels based on the difference between base flood elevation and where the first floor was on all these historic buildings. So in this map, the red is bad. That's essentially you're below the base flood elevation. What that means is on average in a 100-year flood, your building will be flooded, almost guaranteed. And so we've been able to create this as a resource to property owners to help them understand their flood risk in Houston, Texas here, and then in the Strand, which was the first example that I showed you, where essentially everything is underwater. And so for individual buildings, that allows us to give more information to property owners about the inundation, whether it be flooding, whether it be storm surge, information for individual property owners to better understand potential impacts of hurricanes, storm surge, and inundation events. So those are just sort of the ways that I'm working on understanding and managing heritage at risk. But I want to sort of end, and I realize that I've been talking for half an hour now, even though I said I wouldn't talk for more than half an hour, with this incredible opportunity and project that I'm working with in the Commonwealth Heritage Forum, which is a new charity based out of London. I've been lucky enough to work with them. I'm the primary university partner with them, and they're also working with the Princess Foundation as well. And so this new Commonwealth Heritage at Risk project seeks to identify at-risk heritage from across the Commonwealth, do risk assessments of those identified sites, and then do traditional building trainings with the Princess Foundation. And so what does that mean? We've working with some colleagues on the north coast of Jamaica. Essentially what that means is you identify traditional building artisans who do training to teach people how to lay lime mortar, how to do masonry repair, how to do timber repair, to build up a capacity and a workforce in the building trades that is heavily underserved and underrepresented. Basically now to have these skills, you have to go to the UK or the US to be trained. And so there's that lack of capacity for properly managing and rehabilitating historic structures across the Commonwealth. It's a known issue. And so what this program is doing is we are, again, sourcing opportunities over a 5-year project that's been funded to identify opportunities for joint training between stakeholders in the locale and then stakeholders and students in the UK to, again, provide that immersive learning for everything from, let's say, buildings assessment, cemetery repair. So how do you clean? How do you manage? How do you rehabilitate? Yawn repairs, reconstruction, as you see here on the left, historic buildings, historic cemeteries. Things like proper lime mortar pointing and application, and teaching people that cement is not what you want to use. Portland cement is awful. How to make lime mortar, how to apply it in a joint, how to remove Portland cement, how to apply lime wash, how to make lime mortar. So, in Jamaica, a few years ago, we created a lime richt to actually burn lime mortar because there was no lime mortar production on the island. And so all these historic buildings were getting Portland cement and they were just falling to pieces because Portland cement is essentially the worst thing you can do in a historic building that has any masonry in it. And so, and then other things like metalwork, timber repair, all those things that are baked in as opportunities within this project that'll span 5 years and hopefully will sort of ramp up over time. So really the point of this talk today was to let you all know about this opportunity for, I'm the primary university partner. I've worked with the trust now for 15 years, since 2007. I think this is a huge opportunity for engagement and training in Bermuda, and Bermuda being a part of the Commonwealth, I think is critical, particularly given the best practices regionally that Bermuda and the National Trust undertake on a daily basis. This program would be a huge opportunity to showcase the challenges, but also the capacity that the island has within the wider region. So I will end my disjointed talk there, but thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Brent. I certainly enjoyed that very much. I'm sure everybody did. Just fantastic to see the breadth of work that you've been doing. And I'm sure that's just a tip of the iceberg in terms of everything over the years, but it's really exciting. I'd love to invite comments from everybody, but just an overarching thought that, I'm just so pleased to see how you bring together this issue of sort of local realities and constraints and what we face, on the ground, not just in the heritage sector, but Bermuda as a whole, because as you were pointing out, these are lived heritage spaces. Built heritage is throughout our entire landscape. So, the fact you're focusing on actual realities, looking ahead to climate change, but also just how people need to live, but matching that with some real innovation and creativity. I think we certainly need creative solutions to things. And I really love the sort of blend of the digital and the tangible. So I have some questions about that, but I want to open it up to the audience. But just also to say that it's the proactive approach to things, and especially in terms of engagement, how to engage young people and new generations who will become the stewards and custodians moving forward. It's just great to see those different elements of local needs being addressed, the sort of the creative side of things, and then the proactive engagement piece. So I certainly enjoyed it. I'd love to open it up to the floor, and I'll come back if I need to. Thanks.
I'll just sort of say to that, Charlotte, I think, that is that sort of stakeholder first, and really the practical side of preservation is the only way, solving real world problems. That's the only way that heritage conservation and preservation can remain relevant in the 21st century, because there is so much going on, as we all know. So much going on, the echo chamber of news, forces, local and global, inflicting everything upon us. The only way for preservation and built heritage to remain relevant is to take this practical stakeholder first approach. And it's how we have to approach the way that we train our students moving forward. Because as we know, preservation and basically anything that's not STEM or finance related is on the downturn in the universities. It is primarily people who want to make a pile of money or work in the technology industry and allied fields. And so we have to find a way to engage young people and train them and make them aware of these challenges from a very young age. You know, one of the most rewarding and challenging times of my life, and Dorta was there, the archaeology camp that we did up at Vermont. But, you know, there were tangible students, you know, there were numbers of students who might have went off and gotten a history degree or went off and got an archaeology degree. And hopefully they might come back to Bermuda. I know that there are many people on the call who've done that. And creating that sort of pipeline for the next generation and the leaders, particularly on Bermuda in this area, is critical in ways that universities in particular have to serve the stakeholders in the communities that we engage with.
Yeah, thanks, Brent. Anyone have any questions? You feel free to come on the video or put it in the chat. Love to hear any thoughts. No pressure though.
I bored you all to death.
No.
I have a question.
Okay.
Hi, I have a question.
Please go ahead, Nikki.
Okay, sorry, I thought you didn't hear
Yeah,
me.
yeah.
Yes, how do you see this working? I guess it's done before. I'm just new to this. For instance, I'm new to the trust, and I've seen a lot of our cemeteries have had, you know, some of the tombstones are broken. There's issues with them. How do you see, for instance, that program working with what you're doing? What would you do? Would you bring someone to Bermuda to teach someone through the Prince's Trust? How do you see it practically working with the Bermuda National Trust and their issues with, for instance, cemeteries?
Absolutely. So, you know, this is, you know, we spent 2 weeks ago, we spent 2 days talking about these great lofty ideas. And I was always sort of trying to pull the conversation back to, well, how do we actually make this work? I think, you know, particularly for the cemeteries piece, and I should say that, you know, this sort of this training and capacity building mission is a part of the way that I'm thinking about my program, engaging with the trust moving forward, inside and outside of that program. And so we can draw on not just people from the Prince's Trust, but say, for instance, a faculty member here who's an architectural conservator who has both professionally and through her teaching and research here at the university has worked with the repair of gravestones. And so one way this could really work is by myself and her coming down as faculty members, potentially with or without our students, doing training workshops on how to clean monuments, how to identify and come up with the best repair approach for monuments, and then thinking about the little everyday management plan, you know, the little things you do every 3 months or the little things you do every 6 months for the historic cemeteries. And so, and then we do that once and then we come back. And so whether you engage with primary school students, whether you engage with trust volunteers, just start creating this capacity and this generation of best practices for managing historic cemeteries. And then it just becomes routine as a part of the management of these sites. You know, the real challenge in many cases is materials and being able to work with materials. And I think that's where initial sort of triaging of stones that need more work, whether you need, you know, a crane, whether you need specialized materials like yawn, which is basically a type of bonding agent that's sensitive to historic materials, particularly the limestone that's on Bermuda. For us to be able to import that and then use it and then train people to get them yawn certified, it's really thinking about how we can build that training capacity on a year-on-year everyday basis. And so I would love for when I bring my students down once a year, we spend a couple days working with my students, high school students or trust volunteers, doing just that, doing the actual training of how to do it. And our students are trained in our program how to do that in New Orleans. And so applying that knowledge in Bermuda is an easy extension of it.
And how does this work with, you say this is funds from the Commonwealth, a $5 million fund. How does this work with the funding? Does that fund pay you to come down here? And how does that work?
No, really what the funding is for being able to compensate students and faculty members who come down and do the teaching. The funding is primarily for the teaching. The assessment is really sort of in kind from us as university partners. And so we come down and we set up these opportunities for teaching, but at the same time, Bermudians, if they were involved, would also potentially go to the Princess Foundation and other points in England to get additional training on top of that. And so it's the funding is really for the benefit of the students within the program. And then our university actually provides further teaching capacity on top of it in kind.
So is it the teaching and also the accommodation, or just the teaching?
That's things we always have to just sort of figure out, on a case by case basis as a part of it. I mean, we've been lucky enough that the work that we've done in St. George's, we've been able to get grant funding to cover a lot of the costs for us to come down. So it hasn't cost the trust anything. So that's just sort of a part of the case by case approach to things.
So potentially this could be used to send Bermudians, if for instance, if you come down, teach us how to repair, or how to repair the cemeteries, or how do you describe, not use cement and use lime, then the part of that funds could be used to send Bermudians, or no, that's just for your teaching?
No, so part of those funds would actually bring UK students, because the donor is based in the UK and wants engagement between UK students and students in the Commonwealth. So it would have funds to bring UK students for the training, and then send local students to the UK for additional training as well with other partners.
Okay, because Bermuda is UK as well, so that it wouldn't be considered, the students here wouldn't be considered as UK citizens?
People who are based in England and Wales and Scotland, essentially.
Okay.
Good evening, Brett. I'd like to ask you about Appleby House. I was wondering if you're familiar with Appleby House in Appleby House Park. There, it's a brilliant, old, very famous estate, building that the Estates Department of Works and Engineering are trying to develop a public-private partnership for the restoration of this building. And until probably 10 years ago, it had a roof. It no longer even has a roof, but the walls are such that they're so smooth. I believe the British masons 150, 200 years ago were using turtle oil to plastering these walls. The walls themselves are about 18 inches thick, and the paint is just like a piece of glass. However, the building doesn't have a roof on at this point. It has a very interesting roof structure. And the Parks Department have gone in and cleared all around the building. There isn't much left of it. Can you give us more information about the state of that building?
So I haven't seen it probably in the last 3 or 4 years, unfortunately. But I think that, that in terms of, thinking about a list and triaging of important sites and built heritage, to me, that would definitely be one that would be high up on the list for Bermuda. And it also helps that it's in sort of the public realm as well, managed by, is it managed by Parks or by
It's
the Conservation Services?
It's Steve Conway, who used to be the director of Parks of the National Trust some time ago, is now in the Estates Department, head of the Estates Department at, I guess, Works and Engineering. And he and his colleague have recognized the value of the building, and they have had the Parks Department go in and clear all the vegetation out from around it and then fence it all off. There's not much left. There's just basically 4 walls and a spectacular roof structure, sort of very old pine roof structure with lots of metal bracing and so on. They've taken the floors out because they had all rotted out. But it would be it's an interesting site. It had such a vibrant history. It was a community center for the longest time, and there was a fellow, his name was Chan McIver, who rented Admiralty House for $1 a year or something, and he kept the building up himself at his own. He lived on a trust fund at his own expense. He used to run community groups there, the early computer program groups called Burmug and a number of things, but they decided that he should go, and since he left, the building's fallen apart. I would be curious about the public-private partnership concept that Works in Engineering are promoting. And I would like to think that it could work, but in this case, there's really not much left of the building.
Yeah, I mean, I think, one of the things that from my point of view would be great to think about is can we go in and document the building and then come up with a management plan for its current, based on its current state, to understand what are the things you need to do, A, B, C, D, to ensure that there's not continued degradation of the material fabric. And, conservation plans aren't flashy things, but they create a pathway to better managing structures like this. Because if you don't do anything and manage particular water intrusion into the structure, it's going to be gone sooner rather than later. So, that would be another example in which maybe this isn't a bricks and mortar opportunity, but maybe this is an opportunity to engage with Works in Engineering, with Parks, with others, to come up with historic structures management plans for buildings that they care for as a part of their mandate.
Good idea. I will follow this up with Steve Conway tomorrow, because I had a look at the building and I thought, well, if nothing else, I would like to salvage the timber out of it. And he said, oh, no, we have a plan going forward. And since I first expressed interest, they have cleared the vegetation around it. So the building is now free and clear of all of it, and they have made an effort to clean it up. But I'd like to know what the plan going forward is that he has, and perhaps get him in touch with you, and maybe you guys can put your brains together on this one.
Absolutely. I mean, I'd love to see what state the building is in on the next time that I'm down.
I'll send you pictures.
Great.
It's a bit grim.
Yeah, I saw it recently too. It is, and I think that just speaks to the issue of prioritizing, like you say, identifying and prioritizing what, because there is so much heritage at risk and not everything can be saved. So what can be recorded prior to its loss, at the very least. But I think that sort of prioritization and democratizing the process and having a values-based approach, it may not align with that sort of, the more traditional colonial paradigm that we've had, Brent. But it could open us up to saving buildings and sites that we wouldn't even be considering otherwise. So, and I just think more sort of democratized heritage processes where people are voting on what they think, identifying and voting on what should be saved is probably, that sort of model we should be moving to. So I just really appreciate that. Are there other questions out there? And great to see everyone.
Charlotte, just
Yes.
to I think the approach of the Barbados National Registry is just absolutely fabulous. That people can nominate a site. That they're, that the symbols of struggle, enterprise and culture, and historical significance it comes from the entire community. Not just from our organizations, and to put together a map and a register from all of our heritage organizations on the island would be extremely powerful. I think it would be very engaging and all inclusive. So, Brent, thank you for bringing that to our attention. I've never heard of it, and I'm quite excited about that, and I'm sure Charlotte and I will be talking a bit more about it, how we can, how we can rope that into the National Trust programming.
Absolutely. And it's one of the things that increasingly in the 21st century, as you all know, it's in terms of protection and listing of historic structures, it's not just about integrity. It's not just about, what's left that's a part of the tangible heritage. Increasingly, placemaking as a part of a broader intangible heritage landscape is critically important to values of stakeholders throughout the world. And so really that approach in Barbados acknowledges that essentially you can nominate sites that have tons of integrity, sites that might not have any integrity. It might just be a place. And that, again, as I said earlier, one of the amazing things about Bermuda is that so much of the built heritage, the buildings that have integrity, have been mapped and recorded. And so this would be value added to those buildings that have already been identified that more equitably and inclusively engage with areas that aren't represented, primarily because, as we all know, the listing system is built on this Western idea of integrity. What survives, and that's prioritized over things that might not retain that same level of integrity.
Mm-hmm.
Brent, we have a question from Tiffany Banner on the chat, thanking you for the presentation and agreeing that it would be great to have a similar community-led register in Bermuda. She asks, do you have any more suggestions as to how to encourage community participation, wider stakeholder engagement, for instance, within St. George's?
I think, that's something I've been struggling with for now 15 years. It's incredibly difficult. And it is a moving target, but I think at the same time, we can't idealize that participation and engagement. And you just have to keep working at engaging with people. And whether that's through working charrettes, whether that's through even things, out of the social science playbook, things that are called intercept interviews, where essentially you're, standing on the corner and just attempt to engage with people who are walking down the street who are residents. All those are sort of the tools of the trade in terms of trying to engage people about both tangible and intangible heritage. The challenge is that if they don't want to engage in that conversation, there's very little you can do, and nor should you force them to engage in that conversation. And so I think it really is grassroots at its core. The successful projects throughout the world are grassroots in origin. And it really, I think, but at the same time, St. George's has such an opportunity because there are so many heritage partners that are established there to be that connective tissue to be able to bring people together in a conversation. And
Brent, it just reminds me, as you say that, it always becomes, when you're sort of making those interventions with the community, we often forget that there's heritage uses going on all the time, particularly, within people's homes and sites. And so it's how we maybe frame that questioning, where we ask it, how we do it, and that it's somehow flipping it. So it's not centered on our agendas as heritage groups and professionals, but on, just on the lived experience of people. So yeah, sometimes it's different people asking the questions too, and different, but I'm just always reminded the heritage uses are so constant and so they're just embedded in people's lives all the time. So yeah.
And I think that fundamentally, from a World Heritage point of view, that is the challenge of the disconnect between focusing on management, focusing on interpretation, and understanding the built environment as lived experience that people live in every day. So we focus so much about updating management plans or updating interpretation plans, which we have to, but how do we directly engage with people who live in these buildings, who walk down these streets every day? And how do we, as you say, Charlotte, flip the script to understand how they want the site to be engaged with as people who live in St. George's or any World Heritage site? It's hard. It's incredibly hard, particularly because of the challenges right now of the pandemic, where people have retreated. They're not as open in terms of engagement. It's a real challenge.
Oh.
Exactly. Do we have other questions? Xander?
I have one. As someone who is already out here doing my master's in archaeology, and I am planning on coming back to Bermuda, is there anything that you could suggest that I do to help push this? Because I think it's a, it's a massive hole in Bermuda right now. We don't have any archaeological guidelines for planning or works in engineering. And I want to know, what do you think I could do to help?
Maybe Xander, you need to follow up your degree in archaeology with a law degree to be able to go after policy change. But I mean, that is fundamentally one of the biggest challenges that we've witnessed in the last 12 months in St. George's, is understanding archaeological impacts through normal everyday works in engineering. And I won't go into the details of it, probably because Charlotte would, if she were here, she'd be pulling my hair out. But, trying to lobby for policy change, but then enforcing the policy is the biggest gap in legislation when it comes to heritage across the world.
Yeah.
And, think about this, in England, the US, there is a whole cottage industry of cultural resource management. People that their only job is to do mitigation review for historic impacts, whether it be demolition, whether it be putting a new road in or something like that. Getting that legislation in place in Bermuda and having government entities enforce it is critical. But it would also, ironically, create jobs in the heritage sector that currently aren't there in Bermuda, because you need people with expertise. You need people who understand the policy to be able to be there and review the impacts, write the impact statement, write the mitigation strategy. That is critical from a policy point of view in being able to engage in sustainable practices.
Yeah.
And there's no answer to that. Again, I hate to keep saying there's no answer other than keep banging down the door. But I think the other thing is that really one of the things, particularly in the United States, the adversarial relationship between policy, stakeholders, and people who are in planning and development only shuts doors. And so finding ways to work with policymakers, with developers, as much as we might, not want to do that, is the only way that we can begin to sort of pick away at these challenges. I would love for there to be archaeological review work in Bermuda, and I would love for there to be a small archaeology team that essentially would be employed for mitigation to be able to go in and manage new development.
Yeah, I'd love that as well.
that needs to happen. And for far too long, it's been people, external archaeologists in particular. So, Dr. Harris has called on Marley Brown, myself, Michael Jarvis is in review work. Having external people have to come in and do that review, that doesn't serve the stakeholders in Bermuda. That just continues to create relationships of power between who has the expertise and resources to do these kinds of critical review work. And so, it'd be great if there was someone in the planning office that when something was going to be impacted, they picked up the phone and called someone, whether they be working for the trust, working for the museum, working in a private entity, to be able to go down and do review. Instead, we're always just sort of running around trying to catch up because there's no policy in place, which is a challenge.
Brent, I just want to add that it's not only that there's a real lack of diversity as well within the heritage sector here. So opening that up through these sort of programs is another really, and I know that's rich me saying that, but again, it's like you said, getting beyond the authorized groups and involving others, but training people up to expand the sector. So the sector is more representative of the community itself, as so I just wanted to add that in because it seems again, part of what you're trying to do, I think.
It's incredibly challenging. And, in the United States, if you look, the National Council for Education and Preservation just released a climate survey that demonstrated in terms of in terms of the number of people who are enrolled in preservation programs in the United States, overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly middle upper class. And so that training pipeline just creates to reinforce this lack of a diverse and inclusive approach to the people doing the work in the future. And I think so much of it, as you say, Charlotte, is about education, that there is a value to this kind of work. And there's a value in bringing about more inclusive and representational transcripts of heritage from the past and in the present. And that's critical. But all preservation programs across the world are essentially challenged by that lack of diversity. And it comes from the antiquarian nature, the historicity of what we do is, the 17th century, this was an antiquarian endeavor, what we're doing, right? And that's just been made more durable even through into the 21st century.
Well, like you said earlier, that decolonizing the project, decolonizing archaeology, it's definitely at the forefront now of something we need to do. So again, this idea of training up local, training up Bermudians to, to have these skill sets and to really be able to bring in best practice. And again, we have someone like Xander who's studying that, and we have others on the call who've studied that sort of stuff. Yeah, no, I'm really hopeful. Do we have other questions?
But it's critical to have the jobs for those people to come back to. That is the number one challenge, I think. After you get someone in the door.
And how hard would it be to, because I have zero idea on how this types of things work, but how hard would it be for someone like me to come back and then use my archaeological training and knowledge to at least attempt to train some locals, like a lot of commercial archaeology units do here in the UK. They'll take people who don't even have an undergrad in archaeology and train them to do the things that are needed on site. Just wondering how hard would that be to do in Bermuda, do you think?
It's not hard. It's just finding the opportunity to do it and building the relationships with people who have an interest in it. It's going into, the history classroom in a primary school and talking to people about, it's not just about reading about history in books. It's about actually understanding the material component of it and getting them excited about that.
I definitely have quite a few, at least, connections at Work Academy. I could try and push like presentations and stuff there, and
we worked, and I can't remember when that was, Dorta, when we worked on creating the archaeology training for the curriculum in middle schools and high schools in Bermuda. That was a while ago. I mean, those are efforts that we started and need to, continue to be pushed, not just through trust programs, but integration into the curriculum at schools is critical.
Yeah, you could try and make BTEC. They have those at Work Academy as well, and they do it for very specific sectors like hotels and service industry and that type of thing.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that in Barbados we talked while we were on at this conference. We talked with the technical college about creating a certification for historic buildings training on top of a contractor certification. So essentially, people would be, you'd be able to give them a certification that they wouldn't just work on historic buildings, but they would be on a list of people that you would call. Imagine having a list of Larry Mills, to be able to call on, who are actively in the commercial sector, to come and work and know how to sensitively engage in listed buildings and historic structures on Bermuda. That would be an ideal certification through the college in any sort of technical component of it moving forward.
Well, thanks, Brent. Do we have any other last questions?
Yeah, Brett, what's your email, Brett?
I'll write it in the chat. It's just my name @gmail.com with the period in the middle of it.
I also just wanted to say, Charlotte, because I've been studying under him quite a lot. John Adams gives his best.
Oh, great.
He wanted to make sure I somehow got in contact with you, so this is perfect.
Well, it's great to see you. We need to be in further touch as well. But yeah, so just to say, it's just great to see everyone's engagement with this, because I think what Brent is speaking to and all of you is just these pretty big infrastructural and capacity issues for cultural heritage management and built heritage specifically, which can be quite intensive, but is part of this bigger spectrum of cultural heritage that we have to manage. And I just love, Brent, how you're bringing out that, at some level, all heritage is intangible, but built heritage does have special needs. And so, the focus and the skills and that skill development it can potentially do so much for Bermuda if we are focused on what the local needs are and who is in greatest need. Again, like we were talking about schools, as we know, the public schools need to be a big focus that we have. You mentioned the technical education. So I think, it's almost thinking of ourselves as heritage activists to some extent to make the work more relevant and starting with the values in the community. I get very excited hearing what you're doing. And again, the fact there's actually grants out there is very heartening, because as sophisticated and as privileged as we are here in Bermuda, we do need a lot of support. So we just really appreciate your efforts.
Well, one thing I'll say, and again, it makes me feel incredibly old. In a perfect world, I would not have any role to play in Bermuda. There would be capacity to be able to do the kind of work that we do. And I hope that we work toward that one day, and it's really through, it's incredible to think, after being here for 15 years, what seemed like a very long time ago, working with Xander, working with Britt, working with Zoe, working with Deborah, on various projects in, 2007 and 2008 and 2009, it's really, and truly, as I increasingly become old and decrepit, it's really on them to go out there and be evangelists for this kind of work moving forward. And it's incredibly exciting to see that they have had such an interest in returning to Bermuda and providing, really incredible support and capacity as they have gone through their development and training.
Well, Brent, you're literally the reason that I first started getting into archaeology. You were my first experience with it, and it shot up from there. So.
Well, awesome. Well, thank you all for coming tonight, and a very, very big thank you to you, Brent. We really appreciate everything you've shared, and most of all, appreciate your work. So, and looking forward to continued collaboration. And again, we're not just doing this as the professionals. We want to hear from all of you. This is joint efforts. We need to find frameworks where you guys can, feed in and share it with family and friends. We need to reach the broader Bermuda community and the Bermuda diaspora. So, let's keep in touch, and, know that the heritage team at the Trust, along with the wider team, we're here to work for the natural and cultural heritage for everyone. So all the best tonight, and thank you all for joining us.
Thanks, everybody. We'll come visit New Orleans. Not during Mardi Gras, though.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brent. Bye.